Why did the sheriff's stable son unlock the outlaw's cell and kneel after watching him every night? The iron key trembled in my hand as I knelt before him in the darkness of the cell, my heart hammering so violently I was certain he could hear it. Jesse looked down at me with those storm-grey eyes that had haunted my dreams for 17 nights, his chains rattling softly as he reached toward my face with bound hands. "Caleb," he whispered, my name breaking on his lips like a prayer. "What are you doing?" I couldn't speak, couldn't explain. All I knew was that I'd rather betray my father, the sheriff of Redemption Ridge, than watch them hang this man at dawn. Because somewhere between the first night I'd brought him water and this moment, kneeling on cold stone while the whole town slept, I'd fallen impossibly, irrevocably in love with an outlaw who was supposed to die in the morning. 3 weeks earlier, I'd been mucking out the stables behind the sheriff's office when the commotion started. I was 19, practically invisible in this town, the sheriff's son who'd rather spend time with horses than people, who'd never quite fit in with the other young men who talked endlessly about the saloon girls and their Saturday night conquests. I'd learned to keep my head down, do my work, and try not to think too hard about why those conversations made my stomach twist with something that felt like longing mixed with dread. The sound of hoofbeats and shouting pulled me from the stable. My father, Sheriff Thomas Ward, rode into town with his deputy and 3 men in tow, one of them draped over a horse like a sack of grain. They hauled him down roughly, and that's when I saw his face for the first time. Even bloodied and barely conscious, he was striking, sharp jawline, dark hair falling across his forehead, features that looked carved from marble. My breath caught in my throat in a way that made me look away quickly, that familiar shame heating my cheeks. "Get him in a cell," my father barked, dismounting with the satisfied air of a man who'd accomplished something important. "Jesse McCrane, wanted in 3 counties for robbery. There's a $500 bounty on his head." The deputy dragged the man, Jesse, toward the jail while my father approached me, clapping me on the shoulder with rough affection. "Caleb, you'll need to keep an eye on the prisoner nights. Make sure he gets water, doesn't die before the circuit judge arrives in 3 weeks. "Can you handle that?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. My father didn't notice. He never really looked at me long enough to notice much. That first night, I carried a tin cup of water to the cells in the back of the sheriff's office, my hands unsteady. The jail was small, just 3 cells, only one occupied. Jesse sat on the narrow cot, his back against the stone wall, one eye swollen shut and a cut across his cheek that needed stitching. When I approached, he didn't move, just watched me with his one good eye, alert and calculating despite his injuries. "Water," I said quietly, unlocking the small slot in the bars and sliding the cup through. He studied me for a long moment, making no move to take it. "You're the sheriff's boy," he said finally, his voice rough but not unkind. There was a slight drawl to his words, something that suggested he'd come from farther south. "Yeah," I managed, my throat tight. Up close, even battered and imprisoned, he had a presence that made the air feel thinner. "Caleb," he nodded slowly, then reached for the water with hands that were surprisingly steady given his condition. He drank deeply, then handed the empty cup back through the bars. "Thank you, Caleb." The way he said my name made something flutter in my chest, a sensation both terrifying and exhilarating. I took the cup quickly and retreated, feeling his gaze follow me all the way out. I couldn't stop thinking about him that night. Lying in my narrow bed above the stable, I stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of the strange pull I'd felt in that cell. I'd spent most of my life trying not to acknowledge what I was, the way I'd catch myself looking at the ranch hands when they worked shirtless in the summer sun, the way I'd never felt even a flicker of interest in the girls who sometimes smiled at me in church. But I'd become expert at pushing those thoughts away, at burying them so deep I could almost pretend they didn't exist. Jesse McCrane had shattered that careful construction in a single evening. The next morning, I learned more about the man in my father's jail. He'd been riding with a gang that had robbed a bank in Silver Creek, shooting a clerk in the leg during their escape. They'd been tracked for 2 weeks before my father and his men caught up with them in the canyon country north of town. The others had scattered, but Jesse's horse had stumbled, and he'd taken a bad fall that left him vulnerable. He was lucky to be alive, my father said over breakfast, though the hangman's noose waited at the end of his luck. That second night, I brought not just water but a clean cloth and some whiskey for his wounds. My father had already gone home to his house at the edge of town. He never stayed in the office overnight unless there was serious trouble. I was alone with the prisoner, the silence of the empty building pressing in around us. Jesse was standing when I entered, his hands gripping the bars, and I noticed he was taller than I'd realized, probably 6 feet to my 5'10". "Brought something for that cut," I said, holding up the supplies. He looked surprised, his grey eyes, both visible now that the swelling had gone down, studying my face with new interest. "Why?" he asked simply. I shrugged, unlocking the cell door with hands that shook slightly. I'd never been alone with a prisoner before, never been trusted with this kind of responsibility. Part of me knew I should be frightened, but a larger part felt something else entirely, a reckless curiosity, a need to be close to him that I couldn't explain. Because it needs stitching, and if it gets infected, you'll be in even worse shape, I said, trying to sound practical. He backed away from the door slowly, holding his hands up in a gesture of peace. I'm not going to hurt you, he said quietly. I'm not going to try to escape. Something in his voice made me believe him. I stepped into the cell, my heart racing, and gestured to the cot. He sat, and I knelt beside him, bringing myself closer to him than I'd been to any man in my life. The whiskey-soaked cloth trembled as I brought it to his face, and his hand came up to steady mine, his fingers warm against my wrist. The touch sent electricity up my arm. Easy, he murmured. I don't bite. I cleaned the wound as gently as I could, hyper-aware of every place our bodies almost touched, the warmth of his breath on my hands, the way his eyes never left my face. You're nothing like your father, he observed after a moment. Different bearing, gentler. The word should have strung. Gentle wasn't something men aspired to in Redemption Ridge, but from him it sounded like a compliment. He's a good sheriff, I said defensively, though even I could hear the lack of conviction in my voice. My father was competent but good, that was harder to claim. Jesse was quiet while I worked, but I could feel the weight of his gaze, something in his expression that felt almost like recognition. When I finished and stood to leave, he caught my wrist again, his touch feather-light but impossible to ignore. Caleb, he said, and there it was again, that flutter in my chest. What you did, thank you. Most men in your position wouldn't have bothered. I nodded, unable to form words, and pulled away, locking the cell behind me with hands that refused to stay steady. I could feel him watching me as I left, and I knew, with a certainty that terrified me, that I'd be back. The days began to blur into a routine. I'd do my work during daylight hours, feeding and grooming the horses, mucking stables, running errands for my father. But my mind was always on the evening, on those quiet hours when I'd bring Jesse his meals and water, when I'd have an excuse to be near him. We began to talk, tentatively at first. He told me about growing up on a hardscrabble ranch in Texas, about a father who drank and a mother who died when he was 12. About drifting west, taking work where he could find it, eventually falling in with the wrong crowd because they were the only ones who'd take him in. I found myself telling him things I'd never told anyone, about the loneliness of being the sheriff's son, always watched, always expected to meet standards I couldn't quite reach. About my mother, who died giving birth to me, a fact my father had never quite forgiven me for. About the horses, how they were the only creatures I felt I could truly understand. Jesse listened with an intensity that made me feel seen in a way I'd never experienced before. He didn't judge, didn't offer empty platitudes. He just listened, and somehow that was everything. You ever think about leaving? He asked one night about a week into his captivity. We were sitting on opposite sides of the bars, closer than we probably should have been. Redemption Ridge, I mean, seeing what else is out there. I'd thought about it constantly, but admitting it felt like betraying my father, the town, everything I was supposed to be. Sometimes, I admitted quietly, but where would I go? I'm not brave enough for that kind of life. Jesse's expression softened, something almost sad crossing his features. Bravery isn't about not being scared, Caleb. It's about being terrified and doing the thing anyway. As the days passed, I found excuses to spend more time in the jail. I'd bring books. Jesse had a surprising hunger for reading, devouring anything I gave him. I'd stay and read aloud sometimes, and he'd close his eyes and listen, and in those moments, with just my voice and the flickering lamp between us, I could almost forget he was a prisoner, almost forget the hangman's noose waiting at the end of this reprieve. Sometimes our eyes would meet and hold for heartbeats too long, and I'd see something in his gaze that mirrored the confusing tangle of feelings in my chest. The problem was that I was falling for him, and I knew it was the most dangerous, impossible thing I could do. He was an outlaw, a criminal facing execution or life imprisonment if he was lucky. I was the sheriff's son, the one responsible for keeping him locked up. Even if circumstances were different, what I felt, what I was beginning to suspect he felt too, was something that could get us both killed in a town like this. Men had been run out of Redemption Ridge for less. Some had been found beaten in alleys, their attackers never caught. The fear of discovery was a constant weight in my chest. 2 weeks into Jesse's captivity, everything changed. I arrived one evening to find him standing at the small barred window of his cell, his back to me, the last rays of sunset painting gold across his shoulders. Caleb, he said without turning around, and there was something different in his voice, something strained. I need to tell you something. My heart began to pound. I set down the dinner tray and approached the bars slowly. What is it? He turned then, and the look on his face, raw, vulnerable, afraid, made my breath catch. I didn't shoot that clerk, he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. I wasn't even in the bank. I was holding the horses outside. When the shooting started, I ran in to try to stop it, but by then it was done. I tried to help the man, but then the sheriff and his posse arrived, and everyone scattered, and He stopped, his voice breaking. I couldn't prove it wasn't me. The others were long gone, so I ran too because I knew how it looked. But I swear to you, Caleb, I never hurt anyone. He moved closer to the bars, close enough that I could have reached through and touched him. I need you to believe me. I wanted to believe him with an intensity that frightened me, wanted it so badly that I questioned my own judgment. Was this the truth, or was I so desperate for him to be redeemable that I'd accept any story he told? Why are you telling me this now? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jesse's hands gripped the bars between us, his knuckles white. Because you're the only person who's treated me like a human being in longer than I can remember. Because when I look at you, I see. He stopped, something like fear flashing across his features. I see someone who might understand what it's like to pretend to be something you're not just to survive. The words hung in the air between us, loaded with meaning I was afraid to examine too closely. My heart was hammering so hard I felt dizzy. Jesse, I started, but I didn't know how to finish. He was right, of course. He'd somehow seen through every careful wall I'd built, recognized the truth I'd been hiding even from myself. I see the way you look at me, he continued, his voice dropping lower, intimate in a way that made heat rise to my face. I see it because I feel the same thing, and I know how dangerous that is for both of us, but I couldn't let you keep coming here without knowing. Should have walked away, should have reported this conversation to my father, maintained professional distance, protected myself. Instead, I found my hand reaching through the bars to cover his, the touch electric and terrifying and perfect all at once. This can't happen, I whispered, even as every part of me screamed that it already had, that I'd been lost since that first night I'd brought him water. I know, he said, his thumb brushing over my knuckles in a gesture so tender it made my chest ache. But that doesn't make it any less real. He stood like that for a long moment, hands intertwined through cold iron, and I felt the world shifting beneath my feet. Everything I'd tried to deny, every feeling I'd pushed down and hidden away, came rushing to the surface with overwhelming force. I was 19 years old, the sheriff's son in a town that would destroy me if they knew the truth, and I was falling in love with a condemned outlaw. It was the worst possible situation, and yet looking into Jesse's eyes, I couldn't bring myself to care. For the first time in my life, I felt truly seen, truly understood, and that was worth any risk. That night marked a turning point. The careful distance we'd maintained dissolved, replaced by something charged and intense. Our conversations became deeper, more personal. Jesse told me about the first time he'd realized he was different, about a ranch hand when he was 16 who'd kissed him behind the barn and then left without a word, about the years of loneliness that had followed. I told him about the shame I'd carried my whole life, the prayers I'd whispered asking God to make me normal, the way I'd avoided close friendships with other men, because I was terrified of what I might feel. You're not broken, Jesse said fiercely when I confessed that deepest fear. You're not wrong or sinful or any of the things they'd have you believe. You're just you, and that's enough, Caleb, that's more than enough. No one had ever said anything like that to me before. I felt something break loose in my chest, years of self-hatred cracking open to let in the smallest sliver of light. I wanted to believe him, wanted it with a desperation that frightened me. But belief required a kind of courage I wasn't sure I possessed. With 2 weeks left until the circuit judge's arrival, my father began making preparations for the trial. The evidence against Jesse was circumstantial but damning. He'd been with the gang, he'd run from the law, and the injured clerk had identified him as one of the men in the bank, though he admitted his memory was hazy. Jesse's public defender, a disinterested drunk appointed by the court, barely spoke to his client. I watched my father's efficient preparations with growing dread, knowing that unless something changed, Jesse would be convicted, and the penalty for armed robbery with injury was death by hanging. I became obsessed with finding a way to save him. I combed through law books in my father's office late at night, searching for precedents or technicalities that might help. I tried to convince myself I was being objective, that I'd do this for any innocent man, but I knew the truth. I couldn't bear the thought of losing Jesse, of watching them lead him up those scaffold steps, of a world where I'd never hear him say my name again. The knowledge that I'd fallen so completely, so irrevocably, should have frightened me more than it did. Instead, it made everything crystal clear. One night, with 10 days left, I brought Jesse a better meal than usual, beef stew from the hotel, fresh bread, even a slice of apple pie. He looked surprised when I slid it through the food slot, his eyebrows raising. Special occasion, he asked, a hint of dark humor in his voice. Just wanted you to have something decent, I said, unable to meet his eyes. The truth was that I'd been imagining this meal as one of his last, and the thought had made me feel physically ill. Caleb. His voice was soft, concerned. Look at me. I forced myself to raise my eyes to his. Even after weeks in a cell, he was still striking, though thinner now, worry lines etched around his eyes. I need you to promise me something, he said seriously. When the trial happens, if they convict me, I need you to stay away. Don't come to the execution, don't watch, just remember me like this, okay, not like that. The thought of it made bile rise in my throat. I can't make that promise, I said, my voice breaking. Jesse. I can't just, he reached through the bars and caught my hand, pulling me closer. You have to, Caleb, you have a life to live after I'm gone, a whole future ahead of you, don't let this destroy you. You don't understand, I said desperately, tears burning my eyes. I don't want a future without you in it. These past weeks they've been. You've made me feel like I could be myself for the first time in my life. How am I supposed to just go back to pretending after this? Jesse's expression crumbled, his own eyes growing wet. God, Caleb, do you think this hasn't been the same for me? Do you think I don't lie awake at night wishing things were different? But they're not. I'm going to hang, and you're going to survive, and maybe someday you'll find someone who... I don't want someone else, I interrupted, the words torn from somewhere deep inside me. I want you. The admission hung between us, raw and painful and true. Jesse's hand tightened around mine, and then he was pulling me closer until my forehead pressed against the bars between us, our faces inches apart. I could feel his breath on my lips, could count the flecks of darker grey in his eyes. If things were different, he whispered, if we'd met somewhere else, some other life. I'd have courted you properly, taken you riding, shown you the stars from the top of some mesa, made you laugh every single day. We could still have that, I said desperately, knowing even as I spoke that it was impossible. We could run, I could help you escape, we could head west, find somewhere no one knows us. Jesse shook his head, his expression anguished. They'd hunt us down, Caleb, they'd catch us and then you'd hang beside me. I won't let that happen, I won't let you throw your life away for me. But his hand was still gripping mine like a lifeline, and I could see the war playing out behind his eyes, the desire to accept my desperate offer, fighting against his determination to protect me. That night was the first time we almost kissed. We stood there for what felt like hours, faces separated by cold iron, breathing the same air, every cell in my body screaming to close that final distance. But we didn't. Some line we weren't quite ready to cross, some last shred of self-preservation holding us back. When I finally pulled away, my whole body was shaking, and I could see Jesse was in no better shape. "Good night, Caleb," he said roughly. I couldn't speak, could only nod and flee before I did something we'd both regret. The next few days were torture. The tension between us had become almost unbearable, every interaction charged with unspoken words and suppressed feelings. I caught myself taking risks I shouldn't, staying too late in the jail, standing too close to his cell, letting our hands linger when I passed him meals. My father noticed my distraction but attributed it to worry about my duties, giving me a rare speech about responsibility and the importance of not getting attached to prisoners. If he only knew the truth, he'd have dragged me out of that jail by my collar. 1 week before the trial, something happened that changed everything. A telegram arrived from Silver Creek with news that one of the gang members, a man named Dutch Carver, had been caught in Arizona and had confessed to the shooting. He'd named his accomplices, and Jesse McCrane wasn't among them. In fact, Dutch claimed Jesse had tried to stop the robbery entirely and had only been holding the horses because he'd owed Dutch money and was being coerced. The clerk's identification had been wrong. In the chaos and fear, he'd pointed to the wrong man. My father read the telegram with a mixture of relief and frustration, the kind of expression a lawman wears when he realizes he's been hunting the wrong man. "Damn fool luck," he muttered. "All this time and resources wasted." He looked at me across his desk, his weathered face creased with fatigue. "Guess we'll have to let him go. Can't hold a man with no charges." I felt the room tilt, my heart suddenly racing. "Let him go," I repeated dumbly. "When?" my father shrugged. "Tomorrow morning, I suppose. Need to process the paperwork, make it official. But yeah, he's a free man." I should have felt pure joy, overwhelming relief. And I did, I truly did. But underneath that was something else, a creeping dread. Because Jesse free meant Jesse leaving, riding out of Redemption Ridge and out of my life forever. Why would he stay? There was nothing for him here except memories of captivity and near execution. He'd head west or south, find honest work somewhere, build the life he deserved. Without me, the realization hit me like a physical blow. I'd been so focused on keeping him alive that I hadn't considered what it would feel like when he was alive but gone. I walked to the jail that evening in a daze, the key heavy in my pocket, my mind spinning. Jesse was reading by lamplight when I entered, and he looked up with the smile that had become familiar, that made my chest tight every time I saw it. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he observed, setting the book aside. "What's wrong?" I couldn't speak, couldn't find the words. Instead, I unlocked the cell door, something I'd never done except to tend his wounds that first night, and stepped inside, pulling the door shut behind me. "Caleb, what?" Jesse started, but I held up a hand to stop him. "There was a telegram today," I said, my voice unsteady. "From Silver Creek. They caught the real shooter," he confessed. I had to stop, had to swallow against the tightness in my throat. "You're free, my father's releasing you tomorrow morning." I watched the news hit him, saw shock and disbelief and joy flash across his features in rapid succession. He stood abruptly, his hands coming up to his face, and I heard him make a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "I'm free," he repeated, as if he couldn't quite believe it. "I'm really free." Yes, I confirmed and managed a smile despite the ache in my chest. You can leave tomorrow, go anywhere you want, start over. Jesse's hands dropped and he looked at me with those storm grey eyes that had haunted my dreams for weeks. I watched his expression shift as he saw something in my face, some emotion I couldn't quite hide. Caleb, he said slowly, taking a step toward me. Why do you look like your world just ended when mine just began? The question broke something open inside me, and suddenly I couldn't hold it back anymore. The words came pouring out in a rush. Because you're leaving, I said, my voice cracking. Because tomorrow you'll ride out of here and I'll never see you again. And I know that's what should happen. I know you deserve to be free and happy and far away from this place. But God, Jesse, I don't know how I'm supposed to go back to the way things were before you. I don't know how to pretend I don't feel. I stopped, unable to finish, terrified I'd already said too much. Jesse closed the distance between us in 2 strides, his hands coming up to frame my face with a gentleness that made my eyes burn. You beautiful fool, he breathed. Did you really think I was going to leave without you? The world stopped. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think past the feel of his hands on my face, the intensity in his eyes. What? I whispered. Jesse's thumb brushed across my cheekbone, and I realized I was shaking. I love you, Caleb Ward, he said, each word distinct and clear and utterly certain. I've loved you since the second night you came to my cell, when you cleaned my wounds with hands so gentle I wanted to cry. I've loved you through every conversation, every shared silence, every moment you made me feel like maybe I was worth something after all. Jesse, I managed, his name a prayer and a plea all at once. I couldn't process what he was saying, couldn't let myself believe it. I'm the sheriff's son, I can't just leave. I can't. He shook his head, his expression fierce. You can, you told me yourself you've thought about it, that you don't fit here, that you've always felt like an outsider. Come with me, Caleb, we'll head west, find some place where nobody knows us, where we can just be ourselves. I'll work ranches, you're good with horses, we'll make it work, together. The offer was everything I'd dreamed of and everything I was terrified to want. Leave Redemption Ridge, leave my father, the only family I had, ride off into an uncertain future with a man I'd known for less than a month. It was madness, complete and utter madness. And yet, looking into Jesse's eyes, feeling his hands warm against my skin, I couldn't think of a single reason to say no. I'm scared, I admitted in a whisper. Jesse's expression softened, understanding flooding his features. I know, he said gently. I'm scared too, but I'm more scared of losing you, of spending the rest of my life wondering what might have been. What if they come after us? I asked, voicing one of the dozens of fears swirling in my mind. What if my father tracks us down? Jesse considered this seriously, not dismissing my concerns. We'll be careful, we'll take back roads, avoid towns where they might know us. Your father's a good sheriff, but his jurisdiction ends at the county line. Once we're far enough away, we're just 2 ranch hands looking for work. Nobody will look twice at us. He paused, his eyes searching mine. But I won't lie to you, Caleb, it won't be easy. There will be people who suspect, towns we'll have to avoid. We'll have to be careful, cautious, but we'll be together. Isn't that worth the risk? I thought about my life in Redemption Ridge, the loneliness, the constant pretending, the feeling of being slowly suffocated by expectations I could never meet. I thought about my father who'd never truly seen me, who looked through me more often than at me. I thought about the horses I loved, but the town I'd never felt part of. And then I thought about Jesse, his laugh, his intelligence, the way he listened like every word I said mattered. The way he made me feel brave and seen and like maybe, just maybe, I deserved to be happy. The choice, when I really examined it, wasn't hard at all. Yes, I breathed, the word barely audible but carrying the weight of my entire future. Yes, it's worth it, I'll come with you. Jesse's face transformed, joy breaking across his features like sunrise, and then his hands were sliding from my face to my shoulders, pulling me closer. You mean it? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. You'll really come with me? I nodded, my own hands coming up to grip his shirt, anchoring myself to him. I love you too, I said, the words I'd been too frightened to speak finally breaking free. I've loved you for weeks, and I was terrified, and I didn't know what to do with it, but I love you, Jesse. I love you. For a moment we just stood there, holding each other, both of us shaking with the magnitude of what we'd just decided. Then Jesse's hand came up to cup the back of my neck, and he leaned in slowly, giving me every chance to pull away. I didn't. Our lips met in a kiss that was gentle and tentative and perfect, and I felt something slot into place in my chest, like a puzzle piece I hadn't known was missing. When we broke apart, both of us were breathing hard, and Jesse rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. We're really doing this, he murmured, sounding awed. We're really doing this, I confirmed, and despite the fear still churning in my gut, I felt something else too, hope, bright and fierce and undeniable. We spent the rest of that evening planning. Jesse would be released in the morning, and he'd make a show of heading south toward Silver Creek, the direction most people would expect. I'd work my normal routine, raise no suspicions, and then that night I'd take 2 of the best horses from the stable. They were partially mine anyway, since I'd raised them from foals, along with supplies, and meet Jesse at an abandoned line shack about 10 miles northwest of town. From there, we'd head toward Colorado, then maybe up into Wyoming or Montana, following the mining towns where two men traveling together would raise fewer eyebrows. "What about your father?" Jesse asked as we sat side by side on his cot, our shoulders pressed together. "Won't he come after you?" I'd thought about this, turned it over in my mind. Maybe at first, I admitted. But I'll leave him a letter, tell him I needed to find my own way, that I'm grateful for everything but I have to leave. I won't tell him about you, that would only make him more determined to track us down. He'll be angry, disappointed, but eventually he'll have to accept it. He's got his work, that's always been more important to him than I was anyway. The bitterness in my voice surprised even me, but Jesse squeezed my hand, understanding without judgment. "He doesn't deserve you," he said quietly. "Any father who can't see how remarkable his son is doesn't deserve the gift of knowing him." The words made my throat tight. No one had ever called me remarkable before. Average, adequate, competent, those I'd heard, but remarkable, that was new, and coming from Jesse, it felt true in a way I'd never experienced. "Thank you," I whispered, leaning my head against his shoulder, "for seeing me, for making me feel like I could be brave." We sat like that until the moon rose high in the sky, just holding each other, both of us still half disbelieving that we'd found this, that against all odds and reason, we'd discovered something worth risking everything for. Eventually, I forced myself to stand, knowing I needed to maintain appearances, couldn't risk my father finding me in Jesse's cell. "Tomorrow night," I said, memorizing every detail of his face. 10 miles northwest, the old Jensen Line shack. Wait for me." Jesse stood too, catching my hand one last time. "I'd wait forever," he said simply, and kissed me again, deeper this time, a promise sealed between us. The next day was the longest of my life. I went through the motions of my morning routine, mucking stables and feeding horses while my heart hammered against my ribs. When my father came to the jail to process Jesse's release, I made myself scarce, unable to watch without my expression giving everything away. I caught glimpses of Jesse leaving, saw him shake my father's hand with appropriate gratitude, watched him mount a horse and ride south out of town. To anyone watching, it was just a lucky man getting a second chance. Only I knew the truth. I spent the day preparing carefully. I packed light clothes, basic supplies, money I'd saved from working odd jobs around town. I wrote my father a letter, choosing each word carefully, trying to explain without really explaining anything at all. "I need to find my own path," I wrote. "Thank you for raising me, for teaching me, but I need to see what else is out there. Please don't look for me, I'll be fine, I'm sorry." I left it on his desk where he'd find it that evening, my hand trembling as I set it down. As dusk approached, I brought the horses I'd chosen, Thunder, a strong gelding, and Star, a mare with a gentle disposition but surprising endurance, out to the paddock, pretending I was just exercising them. No one paid attention, I did this all the time. When full dark fell and the town grew quiet, I led them away from the stable, my heart in my throat, expecting at any moment to hear my father's voice calling me back. But nobody stopped me, nobody even noticed. I'd been invisible in Redemption Ridge for so long that my disappearance was, in the end, remarkably easy. The ride to the line shack took longer than I'd anticipated, the darkness and my nerves making me second-guess the route several times. But finally, I saw the silhouette of the small building against the starlight and a figure standing outside watching. Jesse. When he saw me, he moved forward quickly, and I practically fell off my horse into his arms. We held each other tightly, both of us shaking with relief and residual fear. "I thought you might change your mind," Jesse admitted against my hair. "I thought you'd realize how crazy this is and stay." I pulled back to look at him, this man I was choosing over everything I'd ever known. "This is crazy," I agreed, "but it's the best decision I've ever made." We rode through that first night, putting as much distance as possible between us and Redemption Ridge. Jesse had been right, two ranch hands traveling together would raise few eyebrows in the territories where we were heading. We stuck to back trails when we could, avoiding larger towns, working our way steadily northwest. It was hard, uncertain, sometimes frightening, but it was also the most alive I'd ever felt. Every day I woke up next to Jesse. Every night we made camp under vast starry skies. Every moment of freedom felt like a gift I'd never dared imagine. We found work on a ranch in southern Colorado after 3 weeks of travel. The owner, a grizzled old-timer named Bill Hutchins, needed hands for the spring branding and didn't ask too many questions about where we'd come from. We shared a bunk in the ranch hand quarters, which wasn't unusual. Plenty of men doubled up to save space. What was unusual was the way Jesse's hand would find mine in the darkness, the way we'd steal kisses when we were alone on the range, the way we'd look at each other across the dinner table and have to hide our smiles. It wasn't perfect. There were close calls, moments when someone seemed suspicious, towns where we felt the weight of hostile stares and had to move on quickly. There were times I missed aspects of my old life, the familiar rhythms of Redemption Ridge, the horses I'd grown up with, even occasionally my father. But every time doubt crept in, Jesse would be there, solid and real, and choosing me every single day just as I chose him. And that made everything else bearable. 6 months after we left Redemption Ridge, we were working on a ranch in Wyoming when a circuit preacher came through. He was an older man, soft-spoken and kind, and something about him made me think he might be different from the fire and brimstone preachers I'd grown up with. One evening, I found him sitting by the creek that ran through the property, and I sat down beside him, my heart pounding. "Can I ask you something?" I said hesitantly. About sin and God, and whether certain people can be forgiven." The preacher looked at me with wise, gentle eyes and said, "Son, I've learned in my years that God is far more concerned with how we love than who we love. If you found someone who makes you want to be a better man, who treats you with kindness and respect, who stands by you through hardship, that's a blessing no matter what form it takes." He paused, then added, "I don't know your story, but I can see you're carrying a heavy burden of shame. Let me tell you something, you are not a mistake. You are not an abomination. You are a child of God, worthy of love and happiness, exactly as you are." I cried that night, years of internalized hatred and shame finally beginning to crack and crumble. Jesse held me through it, and when I told him what the preacher had said, he cried too. It didn't fix everything, we still had to be careful, still had to hide in most places, but it helped knowing that maybe somewhere, someone believed we weren't wrong just for existing. It planted a seed of acceptance that would grow slowly over the years to come. A year after leaving Redemption Ridge, we'd made our way to a small valley in Montana where ranches were scarce and land was cheap. We pooled our savings and bought a modest piece of property, nothing fancy, just a small cabin and enough land for a few horses and cattle. We told people we were business partners, which was true enough, but in the privacy of our home, we were so much more than that. We built a life together, slowly and carefully, learning each other's rhythms and quirks, fighting sometimes and making up, working side by side during the day and holding each other close at night. It wasn't the life I'd imagined as a boy in Redemption Ridge, but it was better than anything I could have dreamed. Jesse made me laugh every single day, just like he'd promised. He taught me to be braver, to stand up for what I believed in, to stop apologizing for taking up space in the world. I taught him that he was worthy of love, that his past didn't define him, that he could trust someone completely and not be betrayed. We weren't perfect, and our life wasn't easy, but it was ours, built on choice and trust, and a love that had survived impossible odds. 2 years after we left, a letter found its way to us through a series of forwarding addresses. It was from my father. I opened it with shaking hands, afraid of what I'd find, but the letter was surprisingly gentle. He wrote that he'd been angry at first, hurt by my disappearance. But over time, he'd come to realize that he'd never really known me, had never made the effort to see who I truly was beneath the expectations he'd placed on me. He wrote that he hoped I'd found what I was looking for, and that if I was happy, that was enough. "You're still my son," the letter ended. "That hasn't changed. If you ever want to write back, I'd like to know you're all right." I did write back eventually. Nothing detailed, just enough to let him know I was alive and well, that I'd found work and a home, and yes, I was happy. I didn't tell him about Jesse, but I think somehow he knew. There was a warmth in his subsequent letters that hadn't been there before, an acceptance of the son I was rather than the son he'd wanted me to be. It wasn't everything, but it was something, and it helped heal wounds I hadn't fully acknowledged were still bleeding. 3 years after leaving Redemption Ridge, Jesse and I were sitting on the porch of our cabin, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple, when he turned to me with a serious expression. "Caleb," he said, taking my hand, "I know we can't make it official, can't stand up in front of God and everybody and say vows, but I want you to know that in my heart, you're my husband, you're my family, you're my home. And I'd spend every day of the rest of my life showing you how much that means to me." I couldn't speak past the lump in my throat, could only nod and pull him close. We didn't need official papers or public recognition. We had each other, and that was enough. Looking back now, I sometimes think about that night in the jail cell, when I knelt before Jesse with the key trembling in my hand, ready to betray everything I'd known to save him. I think about how terrified I was, how certain I was that what we felt was impossible. But we'd proven that wrong day by day, choice by choice. We'd built something real and lasting and true, despite every obstacle placed in our path. And if I had it to do over again, I wouldn't change a single thing, because every moment of fear and uncertainty had led me here, to this porch, this sunset, this man beside me who taught me what it meant to truly live. The end.
If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe for more emotional LGBTQ plus love stories. Like if you believe in love against all odds. Comment and tell me, would you have had the courage to leave everything behind for love? Share this with someone who needs to hear that love always finds a way. Thanks for watching.